How can we make ourselves more efficient? How can we talk to the board? How can we affect the bottom line, reduce risk, and so on? If you think, well, how can we just be a better business in whatever it is that we're doing?
What made you venture into this crazy world of cybersecurity?
So by degree education, I'm an astrophysicist.
So having the interests of the business first and foremost and looking to build security around it, I think that's an evolution that I think as an industry we're going through, and some people have gotten to grips with that and approaching the way you've just described, whereas others are still steep perhaps more in it's got to be secure and how can we secure something, and hope the business will accept the controls that are in place.
One of my early bosses, my first bosses, said to me, which is, he said that effectively you're a business change consultant, but you just happen to change security stuff.
Welcome to Threatcast, podcast by Threatscape. My name is Paul O'Sullivan. I'm the UK Sales Director for Threatscape. In my segment of these podcasts, I'll be interviewing interesting people who've had coalface experience of dealing with the thorny world of cybersecurity, and more importantly, trying to get the stakeholders and the board members of the business brought into good cybersecurity posture. So today, I'm joined by Chris Gunner. I'll let Chris introduce himself. So over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Paul. Yes, so my name is Chris Gunner. I am the Group CISO of Pepper Financial Services Group, which is effectively a sort of federated group of financial services businesses around a significant portion of the world. My role currently is very much a sort of, I guess you could call it a fractional CISO across those groups of businesses, trying to take care of what's important for the group for cybersecurity, but also helping out our businesses on their individual journeys to build good, solid, secure businesses.
Okay, and we'll touch a little bit on background as well that's led to Pepper, but if I may, if we'll go back to how on earth did you enter the world of cybersecurity? Because there's such a spread for all the people I've interviewed and come to know over the years. So what made you venture into this crazy world of cybersecurity?
So by degree education, I'm an astrophysicist. So it was a typical 3-year undergrad degree, but with a master's fourth year. And specifically the master's fourth year was, imagine your typical physics graduate is a bit more introverted, very kind of, not very sociable, very kind of numerical, technically minded, and so on. The fourth year was very much to try and turn that sort of person into someone that was a bit more functional in the real world, to put it bluntly. So there was a lot of presentation skills. There was a lot of things like writing articles for different audiences. So I remember one of the exercises we had to do was a very complicated piece of research. We had to write a research paper, a sort of something for our peers, something in a kind of popular science magazine, then something for school kids, same story, but just over multiple different audiences. So that was interesting because to me, hopefully I wasn't your typical kind of introverted physics sort of person. It enjoyed it from a kind of, a technological sort of aspect, the logic of it and so on. I also wanted to make sure that my career involved people and so on. So we effectively had in that fourth year, lots of placements in industry and so on, and lots of companies coming to see us to say, well, you are the right kind of people for us. And so a company called Detica that some people might have heard of that no longer exists, it's now part of BAE Systems. They came along and did a presentation that effectively said, we need people like you. We need people who are kind of smart, technical, logical problem solvers, but who've had some training in sort of how to interact with people who maybe aren't like that. If you want to be that, I guess the translator thing is the bit that keeps coming up in sort of my career as being a translator between different worlds. So they effectively came and said, we need translators. And I'll be honest, they also, the kind of numbers they said we could earn in the first few years sounded pretty appealing. So I joined them effectively as a kind of generic sort of business technology consultant, despite not necessarily having a business degree or a technology degree, just having a logical mind. And then very much the first project I landed on was a cybersecurity project. I think it was a bit of a dab hand with Excel at the time, and they had a big Excel spreadsheet that the client had given them to manage all of these things that they had to get through. So I was brought on to effectively kind of, project manage the team in that sense. But then the more time I spent with that team, started picking up some of those works. It was writing RMADs or a kind of light version of RMADs that we developed for that client. From there, sort of the world increasingly needed more cyber people. I found myself, enjoying it. It was an interesting piece of work. We didn't call it cyber back then. It's making me sound like an old man, but it was, it was still information assurance and so on. And so the word cyber hadn't really kind of become the sort of marketing term that it is now. So, I sort of saw that the industry was going to a place where my skills, if I stayed in this area, were going to be more and more needed. And so from that point, consultancy in cyber seemed like a very place to sort of, cut your teeth really and see all the different ways in which it was applied. I mostly spent my time on kind of the policy writing, the governance, the risk sort of stuff. rather than the technical stuff because of my expertise, or at least my lack of expertise in the technical stuff. But that was obviously, this is over kind of 10, 15 years, that became a more important part of what we now think of as cybersecurity, rather than it just being a kind of nuts and bolts sort of technical thing back in the day. So I guess I very, very much fell into it, but through that sort of consciously noted that it was becoming more important, that there was interesting work. And so kind of, I guess, tried to sort of steer my career along with the way that the water was going, rather than sort of trying to, carve my own path or anything particularly exciting, if I'm honest.
And interesting you say that, because typically we see people come one or two sides, three nowadays maybe. It's either out and out technical, so they were network technical and went to firewalling and evolved with the security controls that came along during the evolution of the whole, as you say, now cybersecurity kind of marketplace. Or alternatively, people came from that kind of process, GRC type of information assurance side, and then picked up the technical skills and knowledge along the way as the two slowly kind of melded together to help create the CISO role. And more or less, we've seen people come from a more commercial background that are just picking up the skills, and we'll not even get into the whole debates that go on over LinkedIn of a CISO must have this or must have the other. Which we keep seeing.
We were working in a consultancy, and Detica was interesting in the sense that the typical client or the typical project that Detica worked on was one where the traditional previous approach hadn't worked. So we'd quite often go in and someone like the Big Four had turned up and done kind of standard sort of way to do stuff, rewrite a policy in the way that every other business did it. And the client perhaps was seeing that wasn't really working for them. So Detica would often come in to try and do something new. And I think as a result, there were a couple of projects where I was the sole security person, supporting a team of business change or IT consultants to do something with a security objective. And I think for me that there was something one of my first bosses said to me, which is he said that effectively you're a business change consultant, but you just happen to change security stuff. Or as I like to think of it nowadays, I'd like to think of myself as hopefully a business leader with business ideas that's working for a business who just happens to have a toolbox full of security stuff, right? The approaches that I will apply to a problem tend to be security because that's where my skill set lies. But I try to think of how I can make the business successful by applying good security, rather than necessarily thinking about how to secure the business, hoping that the business is successful as a result. It might sound like a bit of a subtle distinction, but I think if you sort of focus on this idea of what are we doing, how can we be better as a business, then the usual things that we talk about a lot of CISOs then fall out of that. How can we make ourselves more efficient? How can we talk to the board? How can we kind of affect the bottom line, reduce risk, and so on? If you think, well, how can we just be a better business in whatever it is that we're doing? I think something a recent
that's an interesting.
Well, just as a recent conversation for that one, perhaps, is I remember we've had a couple of contractors doing kind of virtual CISO roles within the business, and I remember talking to one of them and saying, what are you doing about DORA resiliency, operational resilience, that kind of stuff? And it was interesting. He came back and said, well, that's not my job, so I'm trying to stay out of it. And it didn't really gel with me, because I thought, well, fair enough, it isn't a cyber problem, but if you care about the business, hopefully you do. If they're employing you, either as a contractor or as an employee, hopefully you should be trying to forge bridges amongst perhaps other people. You might not end up forever as part of that sort of arrangement, but you might then say, well, you and you, I know you from separate engagements somewhere else in the business. Let's get, the head of customer success and the head of kind of business continuity. Have you ever spoken to each other? Because if you've spoken to them separately as a CISO, then you can be that translator, that builder of bridges, and maybe they'll form the DORA committee or whatever, and you perhaps are more of an observer. But this idea of sort of, well, it's not purely security, so not my job, gov, just seems very alien to me, because fair enough, there's you've got to defend your own team and make sure you're not being dragged into all sorts of different projects. But at the same time, surely you should be trying to make the business successful while doing security, rather than just aiming to do security as the end game.
Yeah, and I was interested to say there's a couple of points on that there. So having the interests of the business first and foremost and looking to build security around it, I think that's an evolution that I think as an industry we're going through, and some people have gotten to grips with that and approaching the way you've just described, whereas others are still steep perhaps more in it's got to be secure and how can we secure something, and hope the business will accept the controls that are in place, and sometimes we get that bumping of heads. I've seen that a heck of a lot. I see the contractors in there, organisations, and I'm not calling out and saying it's across the board, but there is a very different driver when you are an employee of an organisation and you truly give a damn because you're bought into what the business is trying to do and therefore want to help, And I think then the final point of getting the different people to talk to each other. Conversation with a customer of mine last week, earlier this week, global insurer, tens of thousands of people, and chap I was chatting to there said, that just getting people to talk to each other and getting this mentality of silos broken down and this collaboration, because attackers don't care that you operate in silos. They're just going after the business. They predisposition to kind of little swimming lanes.
Yes.
So if you're not talking to endpoint,
we have to follow various rules internally for budgets or politics or whatever, internal company politics. I'm not allowed to do that because it's someone else's project, that sort of stuff. But the bad guys don't care. They don't care. They'll attack us at 3 a.m. in the morning. They'll attack us because they think there's money to be made. Look at kind of ransomware targets. Whereas a few years ago, I remember looking into this when that pipeline attack, or perhaps the financial bit of the pipeline was attacked, Colonial, in the US. And the bad guys, who I think we eventually were linked to Russia, popped up immediately and said, well, hang on, sorry, we got it wrong. Here's our kind of ethical code for who we will and won't attack. And it was, we won't attack the government. I think basically saying, please, US government, don't come down on us like a ton of bricks. We won't attack hospitals. We won't attack anyone. I think at the time it was, anyone to do with the COVID vaccine and so on. But then in the last 6 months to a year or so, you've had a lot more hospitals and so on getting hit by ransomware groups who either don't have the same moral code or they've just decided, well, there's still money to be made, and for them that's more important than the fact that they are potentially affecting hospital services like we had in London, 6-7 weeks ago. The bad guys have, even if they have morals, they're often a bit flexible, and they'll put them by the wayside if there's a big juicy target to be made.
And a friend of our MD's, Jeff White, who's quite well known for his podcasts and books and other such, he's obviously wrote extensively on that, and specifically a certain nation state that's the modus operandi is make money through ransomware because the sanction to hell, so they kind of don't care.
Or even
here tells conversely of people.
Go on, no.
Or conversely, you've got the situation where, yes, some of the other nation states or the attackers, the criminal underworld in said nation states who have perhaps been used as a proxy to target the West, they're looking and going, well, actually, you're colonial, you can afford it, we're going to double the ransom. Let's go.
Exactly. So the story I was going to interject with was, in case anyone hasn't seen it, was a particular security awareness vendor has just issued a story about how they hired a hacker from that same country that you were talking about. I think at least a couple of articles that I've read suggested that person wasn't hired in order to break into the security company. They were hired just to claim a salary. So, if you think about what, to go back to what we just talked about, the bad, let's say who it is, right? North Korea, they're not looking to hack. They're not looking to break security. They're not looking to do any of that. They're looking to just raise money in US dollars. And they will do that via hacking, yes, but maybe also just being hired by companies and working remotely and collecting a salary. They'll do it by anything. They'll probably all sorts of counterfeit goods that then flow across the border. They just want money and political influence in the region, or money in US dollars and political influence in the region. So hacking for them is just a thing that they do to achieve that greater objective. And in the same sense, I think as security people, security should not be the end game. It should be, what are we looking to achieve as a business? Maybe there's something we can learn from quite as security people.
Well, for lots of attackers for that matter. So obviously, the purpose of this podcast primarily is to tease out those very use cases or those very experiences whereby you've led with, not with security for the sake of security, now work around it business, but what's going to make us better of a business, and what can I apply from a security perspective in order to help achieve that and get that buy-in. Can you give an example of or two of that where you're able to, where you've looked at the business, you've looked at here's a positive benefit for the business to get the buy-in for a cyber initiative?
So I'll give you an example. So Pepper has done quite a lot of work with startups, new businesses that we have incubated is probably the right word. So typically what Pepper does is we find a kind of underserved niche in a market, and then we partner up with some local expertise, and we bring the sort of Pepper magic, whatever, and then the local guys bring the kind of local expertise, and then together we build a good business there, and we build that ourselves. We start with the idea on a cocktail napkin and then develop that over the iterations to then stand up the business, and off we go. One of the pieces that we came across was doing a bit of research into, it was in Indonesia, was in that country there were a variety of things that the business plan, so to do the business plan as it was initially designed meant that we'd fall under the regulation of their local financial regulator, which, for better or worse, in Indonesia is very, very proscriptive and quite strict. So you needed ISO certification, you needed stuff onshore, within the country, geographic country. and so on. So quite a lot of rules that for a startup were having sketched out a bit of a plan of what it would mean if we went along with plan A to develop a secure business that was secure enough, effectively meant that the business plan wasn't workable. We would be spending more on security than we'd be bringing in revenue for a couple of years. So, that was very much a looking at what the existing business plan meant from a security perspective, what we'd need to achieve that, and then putting it in the mix, in the pot. We'd also have to hire lots of people. We'd have to, get offices and all sorts of things. And then, there's a list of kind of assets and liabilities in a new business. There's things you're going to spend. There's money you hope you're going to make. And unfortunately, the initial plan that we looked at, we just had a whole load of stuff that needed to go into security. So one option that we looked at was, well, what if we change the business plan in order to not require all of these security requirements? So effectively sit us outside of the overview of this particular financial regulator in Indonesia. That meant we could effectively avoid the regulation that was intended for larger, more mature businesses, ISO certification on premise, that kind of thing, within geography hosting. And instead we could build a slightly kind of, a more agile business that perhaps could choose where it wanted to pitch its level of security rather than have to do what the industry standard looked like. On one hand, we were looking at doing less security than I was comfortable with, right? If I was thinking of just, we've got to secure all the things, we were doing less than I would like. However, we wouldn't have a sustainable business by that point if we did that. So it's that balance of how much security can you do if the business is then going to, not even collapse, but not even get off its feet at that point. So we then started talking to the project team about, apologies, getting over a cold, what is the risk in running this business? If we don't have a business continuity plan, we get hit by some kind of outage, but that means we can't do the work for a month. What does that look like? And the surprising thing was talking to the kind of project development team who were building up this case to go to the investment board, was they were kind of on board with this because I was effectively talking about risk and reward and opportunity rather than just negative security. This is the bad thing that could happen. Because from a startup perspective, it's all about risk. You are hoping for, you've got a plan that you hope will make some money in 6 months, and then you might evolve the business plan to start another phase of work and then a year or whatever. And so they were looking at it and saying, well, actually, we are, and I think for that, one of those, the words a shoestring was used internally because we are, this is not a particularly solid proposition for this business. So we are not going to throw much money at it, but we're going to basically do the bare minimum possible to be, as secure as we can be in line with the business, and meet all of our obligations and the local obligations that we have there. So when you turn that conversation into this idea of, rather than to secure the business to where I'd like, I'm going to need this much money, you say, well, how much risk are you willing to take on? For a startup, they're willing to take on huge amounts of risk because you are throwing in only a couple of £1 million or whatever it is into that business. And that even if you did everything else right, it may just not work out because that's the nature of starting up businesses. So that was something where I really had a big breakthrough with, that kind of audience, the sort of the business leaders, where they really got this idea of, if I started coming up with, a couple of different plans of how we can put security together. So we can kind of go the bare bones model, we can do the middle, we can do the bells and whistles. And here's how I think it will affect, whether our business could resist this particular type of attack that we think is a certain likelihood or whatever. And that really resonated with them because it was the same language they were talking about when they were sitting there thinking, well, if we charge an extra 0.1% on our servicing fee, we'll get this much revenue, but we then won't get, they were doing all the segmentation analysis about this will make it too expensive for this customer, so we won't bring in this revenue. So they were doing all that kind of hedging effectively of different levels of financial risk. And by trying to sort of think in their way and give them that sort of, give them the advice I need to give them in that sort of language, they can sort of just bake it into their models and say, well, if we go with plan A, version 1 or whatever, then we'll put this security in, but we think we might then, the business might not last 6 months as a result. So it was a good way to, sit alongside a bunch of people that were working on a particular objective, which was to get a viable business plan out, but us kind of look under the hood and understand what it was that the decisions they were making day to day about how much risk we should take on as a startup. So I could kind of slot myself into that sort of line of logic, if that makes sense, rather than just saying, we will need an Azure license with E5, with this, that, and the other, and 20 security people and audits coming out of the way and all the rest.
So basically, in summary then, you looked at how can we game the system, so to speak, in terms of avoiding the overburdening compliance, yet still make it viable and with a certain acceptable amount of risk where we kind of go, well, okay, we'll take that one on the chin.
I think fundamentally, yes. And I think on one hand, that sounds like a bad thing, but then you look at, pick a successful new business of the last 10 years, an Uber or someone like that. They have also gamed the system. Some people would call it gaming the system. Others would say exploiting a niche. That can sound positive to some people, negative to others. Others would say serving an underserviced area of the market. There's lots of pretty words we could use it, but I mean, largely kind of disruptor startup businesses tend to, find a bit that no one can work in and then find a way to work in it. And sometimes those don't work, right? I'm not saying that anyone who exploits a niche is an absolute, success and an angel and, is doing the right thing. A lot of them are probably doing the wrong thing. But the nature of starting a new business from scratch is to try and find somewhere where people need your services and you can provide a level of service that meets all of their requirements. I think we can do that in security, right? If you need a level of security, then for a start, people need to help understand where that is for their business and then figure out the right mix of stuff to meet that level of security. That's effectively what the game is. I think sometimes we get a bit too obsessed with the idea of, we need best of breed and we need the big name brands and so on. Because I can tell you that some of the startups we put in Pepper, we've gone often with local security processes and vendors and so on and technology vendors because the risk is not great enough. And there was something we did in one of our India businesses, which was they needed a calling system for a contact center type arrangement. And India has some of the craziest rules around how you can do outbound calling. So we had to use an Indian vendor to do the outbound calling because there's something about telemarketing that means that you can't it's not as easy as to set up as it would be in the UK. So we had to use a local vendor and they failed all of our security tests to begin with, all of the usual stuff. This was early on before we learned a lot of those lessons. So they couldn't pass our security vendor assessments. The pen test came back with a whole load of problems. And they came back and said, well, we've got other clients, including, Royal Bank of India that are using us and are happy with us. So we're not going to change the way we do stuff in order for, just for you as a small client, because we've got much bigger clients that don't seem to care. So there was, for one, there was a culture thing there of, well, actually, this is all we can get. There is no one else. We can't go with, the kind of big global telcos that we typically would go for some big calling arrangement because they just don't operate in India because of that regulation that makes it complicated. So we then had to change our attitude and, right, well, if we're going to have to accept a lower level of risk, then what does that mean for us? So rather than sort of throwing your hands up and saying, well, we can't use this vendor, which unfortunately I think a lot of security teams still do, and say, well, here's the benchmark, they can't pass it, it's a no. I would say, well, what can we do instead? So in that case, I think we ended up minimizing the data we were sending to that vendor so that we minimized our risk exposure to them, as we had to use a service that was less secure than we would like. And that kind of attitude, I think, it comes from this idea of, well, how are we going to make this business successful? And maybe also I should say an attitude of, and fair enough, the comfort, because we all knew this was a startup and we all knew that maybe it wasn't going to pan out, therefore we should give it a go, but we wouldn't necessarily had too many tears and it didn't work out. But this attitude, if we can't make it work, then we won't make it work and we'll move on. I suppose this is maybe a bit of a unique approach, because in an established business, you can't say, well, we'll do security we like just because you've got to. It's a different argument, but the mentality, I think, is still the same. You can look at it as how I can make this work rather than having to put X amount of security in, because that's what we have.
And that's prompted, I suppose, another question. You've applied that approach in this role. I sense that you must have taken a similar approach in a previous life. Not just like had this light bulb moment and serendipity, I'm guessing. This is as a result of previous experiences. So has there been some time in previous life where you had epiphany of less the department of no's, as the security team often says, and think about how can I say yes? How do I say yes?
I literally somewhere this desk, I've got a place that one of my first bosses gave me that has no on 5 sides and yes on a 6th. And he gave me this when he retired. He said this, he gave it to me jokingly. He said, this is the most important, kind of piece of kit you'll need to pull the dice. Just, tell them whatever it says, because you'll be saying no a lot. And it wasn't necessarily the pitching, like you said, but somewhere I've got it in a drawer, and now and again I think about it and think it's really different nowadays. It really should be 5 sides of yes, but maybe 1 side of no, because every now and again someone comes up with something completely ludicrous that you just got to say flat out, this is incorrect. But for me, it's always yes, but I think I'm not sure where that. Try about kind of woke up in the middle of the night and suddenly had that epiphany, but for me it feels like the consulting background. If you really take consulting as actually trying to improve things, you are able to kind of look at the problem from a different perspective often where well, how else can we achieve this? As a consultant, you're often paid to achieve an objective rather than to do a certain set of tasks. So you do end up with quite a wide playing field of options to achieve the objective. So sort of mentality, I think, it goes back to, this kind of there is no answer. You're sort of trying to discover new stuff. So you've got to look at all the options, and you're trying to prove a hypothesis, and you'll use whatever tools are kind of available. I don't know. It's definitely fun for me. I mean, more of my roles have been, I started doing in-house roles rather than consulting roles. They've more been in what I would call the advisory security roles, where you are not necessarily owning the security functions. You are coaching the best people to own those functions to do as part of their roles. So the thing I'd always use, the example I'd always use, is the guy who manages the firewalls 99% of the time not want that control wrested away from him whenever there's a security update to be applied. He wants to be applying all of the updates, security and performance and maintenance and so on and so forth. If you are effectively the kind of security that sort of you can rip that control away from the guy who does it the rest of the time, and eventually it's going to start to feel disenfranchised, and so you've got to coach them on how they should be doing it as part of the rest of their job, than be the kind of security team that is sort of controlling and insists that they're always right and always have the no to block them. I remember one example when I worked kind of in a P function, and this would transform the security team away from kind of a security engineering, a bit more security engineering team and more of a consultative sort of team. But there was some kind of issue with Chrome. It was just before a change freeze, and IT went into meltdown because patch Chrome across all these devices was just going to cause a huge issue. I think we were the change freeze or something like that. So it was just a huge headache. We spun up all those emergency change boards to look at them. So we were going to fix the problem and so on. And at some point, you were asked to come in and have a look, and we had a vote on the change board, something like that, or a veto on the change board. And one of our guys used to be in the firewall team, and he kind of picked up on and looked at whether actually patching the only way we can fix the problem. It turns out, no, there was actually something we could apply on the perimeter, somewhere in IDS somewhere, a signature that the vendor had already issued that would effectively neutralize the attack at that point. So because it was advertised and hyped as a Chrome patch, the desktop guys, or whichever team it was that responsible for Chrome, kind of took it and went, we'll fix it. It's a hard job. We can't possibly collaborate with anyone else. And that was maybe a good epiphany about where the security, because we kind of spoke over a little bit of everything. Actually, if maybe we thought the problem was here in desktop Chrome, but actually it might be fixable elsewhere, somewhere along the attack path, I guess I would call it, but somewhere else along the infrastructure, and be more simply as well. And Chrome, this was a few years ago, so was quite hard and would involve rebooting all the machines and so on, certainly shutting down Chrome. For some users is impossible because they've got all their work open. But kind of mentality again that how can I not how I do the fix that I've constructed to do, which is perhaps what the desktop team were a little bit too focused on. Just how can we fix the bigger problem, which is that this attack is going on. So that signature available is switched on, it neutralized the attack, and so we were then able to update Chrome at some point when it was a lot less stressed to do so. That to me really that's always a story I think back on as a when the usual approach is a lot more painful than the most efficient approach. So that becomes matched in, I guess, as how can I solve this most efficiently rather than just most succinctly.
Yeah, agreed. Well, I think we'll draw that to a close, Chris. Thank you very much for your time. It's been very insightful. I think there's a few things people can take away from this, so I really do appreciate that. And to the listeners, thanks for hanging around. If you enjoyed the chat, as always, then there's several other episodes of the podcast where we speak to professionals like Chris and talk around the challenge of getting the board bought into cyber. So check it out on your favourite podcast channel, or of course you can hop across to YouTube as well. Chris, thanks again.